In this video, we'll be taking a look at the snapshots that allow us to pull data down from the internet in the form of a RSS XML feed. And then we're also going to start working on the development of our database based on the requirements for our database structure that we already outlined in lesson number 12. So we're taking a look right now at snapshot number 3, which you can download from the same location where you downloaded this video. And our focus is going to be on one specific piece of this application for this snapshot, which took about another hour and 15 minutes or so. Let me double click this and get into this refresh RSS feed underscore click event. And here we have created the code necessary to grab data down from the internet. So let's show you what the end result is. So I'm going to click this and notice that I get a series of message boxes. Each message box contains the values, the title, the link, and the description for an RSS feed on msdn.microsoft.com. Okay, so we can just keep on clicking the OK button, and it continues to iterate through that RSS feed, displaying the data in a message box with each news item. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop this. So that's what we have worked on for snapshot number 3, and let's talk about the code that enables this. First of all, notice that I have used a hard code value to grab down this RSS feed from msdn.microsoft.com. Now the reason I hard coded it was because I needed to work with a real live XML feed, and I didn't want to have to go through the steps of entering it every time. I don't have a database at this point to save all of my channels in, so I just wanted something that I could test out and see if I could grab it down from just one XML feed out on the internet, and then if I can get it to work with one, then I can get it to work with every feed because they're all based on the same standard. So this is just a very temporary thing. Eventually we'll comment this and remove it out from our application. But now on to the meat of our method here. I'm going to move this over so we can see it a little bit better. First of all, notice in lines 149 and 150 I create a web request and a web response object. And the request simply encapsulates all the information that .NET needs in order to find a URL out on the internet. And so we, as you can see here, create a new location, the RSS URL that we have hard-coded here in line 146. And then, in order to retrieve the data back from the internet, we'll use the request.getResponse object. This sets the request object into action by calling its getResponse method, and it returns the values, the RSS XML file, down into this myResponse object. Now we can use the myResponse object in line 153 and extract out the response stream, which is just a stream of information. Again, think of streams as like straws in a big gulp, where you're sucking the Slurpee through the straw a little bit at a time, and it's all getting compiled in your mouth before you take a swallow. Okay, it's kind of a crude example, but it works that's exactly what a stream is. And from this point on, 153, 156, 158, those lines of code are very similar to what we worked with in lesson number 10, working with XML. So this should look very familiar to you at this point. A stream is a stream is a stream. Where we get that stream from is not really important. Now that we have a stream, we can then in line 156 and 158 turn that into an XML document. So we're taking this unformatted string of characters and we're going to turn it into something useful in line 158 by calling that rsdoc.load, passing in the RSS stream. Okay? Alright, so let's move down and take a look at lines 163, where we're using an XPath query in order to find all of the individual news items for our specific channel. So we're going to use this RSSDoc, this XML document object, select nodes, and grab out only those nodes that fit this query. In this case, just grabbing out just the items, and we put those into an XML node list called RSS items. And we're going to iterate through this node list here in just a moment. Then you can see here that I've created 3 variables, title, link, and description. These are temporary variables that will store the values that we're going to pull out for each news item. So each news item has a title, a link, and a description. We're going to suck those values out and then use them to display them in a message box. Now later on we'll probably replace these, but again, just a very temporary way of doing this so that we can get our mind around how this all works, so we can display it in a very easy to understand way just in a message box at this point. Okay, so now we're going to loop through all of our RSS items. Do you remember what those are again? That's that list of XML nodes, all of the individual RSS items that we collected from our feed. We're going to loop through each one, and our intent here is to pull off the title, the link, and the description from each news item. So what we do is create in line 175 a XML node, which we're calling RSS detail. So this will give us the children of the individual news items. And so we'll do something like this: RSS items, item I, where I is the current one in our loop. Okay. Select single node, title. So this will give us just the title node of that XML document. And we'll make sure that it's not empty. And if it's not empty, then we'll grab it off and put it into our temporary variable called title. Otherwise, we'll set title equal to an empty string. We're going to take that exact same approach for the link and for the detail. And then finally, we'll just concatenate all those together in line 213 to show the title, the link, and the description. Now you can see lines 207 through 211 that I've got some to-dos, that things I know that I'll need to do eventually, like check to make sure that this given news item isn't already in the database, and if it's not, then add that news item to the database, and then obviously remove this little message box. There might be some other steps here, but I just want to remind myself that there's some other things to do, that I'm not anywhere near done with this. But you can see that we already had this working because we've already tested it out. Goes out, when we click this, refresh RSS, it created a request object, used the request object to then get a response object, which is just all the data from that particular URL, that rss.xml file on msdn@microsoft.com. It parsed through it, put it into an XML document. We're able to go through each of the news item elements of that XML document and then pull off the title, the link, the description, put them in temporary variables, and then display them in a message box. Okay, so we're moving right along. This is great. Now, in all honesty, when I'm developing this application, I may start by placing all the code necessary to grab down the XML in this button, this code behind for my refresh RSS button. And that works just fine during the early stages of the development, but I can already see a problem. One of the problems is that I hate to put all of my business logic, and this is considered business logic, okay? It's not necessarily the rules of operating your business, but it's those operations that make your application unique, okay? And they're not related to displaying something on our user interface. They're more kind of behind the scenes, gathering up data, parsing through data, calculations, things of that nature. So when we're talking about business rules, we're talking about a generic term that refers to the logic of your application, not the display of how those things get displayed to screen necessarily. So what I'll probably want to do is take all of this code that we just wrote, everything from line 146 to the end of that event handler in line 213, and place this into its own class. Now there's a side benefit to putting it in its own class, and that is reusability. So if in the future I want to use this function in another application, it would be just as easy as taking the class, the file that I'll create for this, and including it in my next project. And since I worked hard to make sure that it's bug-free, then I get that benefit of reuse so that I don't have to do everything from scratch each and every time I sit down to work with an RSS feed. And so I may want to think about how to make this more generalized and less specific to this particular application. So those are all things that I may have to consider, and we will in the upcoming snapshot. So that's it for snapshot 3, and now we're going to set out to work on snapshot number 4. So my goal in snapshot number 4 was to refactor the work that I've done up to this point, taking that RSS retrieval code that I just wrote in snapshot number 3 and putting it into its own class. We've already noted some of the reasons why we want to do that. A clear delineation between the code that will display data on screen versus the code that retrieves the data from the internet. And by keeping our application loosely coupled in that way, it would be easy for us to reuse that code in other applications. That's one benefit. Also, it makes it easy whenever we're working with our application to look at less code in each physical file that we're working with. So with all these things in mind, I created a new file in our application by going to right-clicking on the project, selecting Add New Item, and then creating a new class. I can also just select Class here from the little context menu. And I created an RSS Manager class. Let's take a look at it briefly. Notice that I have now taken all of the code, except for the first line of code, which we'll get to in just a moment. But I've taken all the code that I wrote in the previous snapshot and placed it into this refresh RSS method. And this refresh RSS method will accept one parameter, a string RSS URL. So we're going to still pass in that msdn@microsoft.com/rss.xml file in the form of a string, and then all the rest of the code is exactly the same. Didn't change a thing about it, except for here at the bottom where I make a reference to system.windows.forms.messagebox because in a class it doesn't have any knowledge of this system.windows.forms namespace. So I had to add that in, or I could have used that in the using statement at the very top. Just chose to do it this way. We're going to eliminate this line of code soon anyway. But ultimately, it does the exact same thing as snapshot number 3. So from our main form, whenever now you click on our refresh RSS, we still have that same line of code where I'm hard coding that RSS URL, but this time I'm simply calling the refresh RSS method of the RSS manager, and as you can see, passing in the RSS URL, which is defined in line 146. Now, there's one other thing that I want to point out here, and notice that I've created this as a static method. So this makes it available without having to create an instance of the RSS Manager class. So as you can see how it's consumed here in the mainform.cs, I didn't have to create an instance of the RSS Manager class. I simply used the static method refresh RSS. Now, why did I do that? Why did I create refresh RSS as a static method? Well, in a nutshell, basically, refresh RSS is simply a utility, and it's not your typical creating an instance of an RSS where there might be multiple instances necessary to reflect multiple RSSs in the same way that we might create multiple instances of a car object or multiple instances of in order to keep a collection of these individual objects. We just need a utility, and the RSS Manager class is a good wrapper for that utility. So that's why we use this as a static method so that you don't have to create a new instance of it, keep that instance around. It can just be called just like a utility class. Okay? So that's why we used the static method, and that's pretty much all we did. And as you can see, we'll test our application just to make sure that we haven't broken anything, which is another good best practice, and that is to, whenever you make changes to your code, test often. So we're going to make sure that this little change didn't break anything, and if it did, then we can isolate the change back to what we just did in the last 10-15 minutes or so. So the snapshot didn't take very long. It's a fairly obvious thing that we wanted to do. But it's important from a code separation perspective. It's more of a philosophy of how we're going about development rather than something that we had to do in order to make the application work. We certainly could have left that code right here within our refresh RSS feed _click. There's no doubt about it that that would work. It would just have made our application a little more clunky. This way, we're a little bit more, I would guess you would say, well thought out, a little more nimble. We can use this RSS Manager class in other applications, so we're thinking about how to structure our applications in such a way that we can reuse things in the future. Much like a good pool player who not only takes a shot in order to make put a ball into the hole, but it also sets himself up for the next shot. So that's kind of the mindset of the philosophy behind why we did that. Okay, so now we have finished, or at least for now finished, the retrieval of the RSS data. Now we need to put it somewhere. So in snapshot number 5, we're going to create the database and even start hooking it up to some of the controls on our form. So we'll do that now. Okay, so after another hour or so of software development, we've come up with snapshot number 5. And in this snapshot, I did several things. First of all, as you can see through the Database Explorer, that I was able to create the RSS MDF file. You can see it also displayed over here within our Solution Explorer. To add this file, I simply right-click, selected Add New Item, selected SQL Database, change this to rss.mdf, and click the Add button. Okay, and in this database, I created the tables according to the design that we had for our tables in lesson number 12, in video 12. So we created a folder table, and the folder table has both a folder ID and a folder name. Let me just go ahead right now and show the table definition so you can look through it briefly. And you'll notice that the folder ID is of type int, folder name of type varchar50. Also notice that we have set the primary key for this to the folder ID and set the folder ID column as well as an identity column, setting the increment and the seed values to 1. Okay, so that's the folder table. Let's take a look at the channel table. Let's go ahead and open that up. Same thing with the channel ID, where we've set it to the primary key for our table. Also, we set its data type to integer and the identity specification on for this so that it's automatically numbered as we add new rows into our channel table. You see we have a title and URL, both of varchar 1000, last updated, small date time, and folder ID of type integer. Again, the purpose of that folder ID is that foreign key relationship between the channel table and the folder table. Okay, and then finally, let's take a look at the news item table. We're going to open the table definition, and again, news item ID. We've got the primary key set to that column, type integer, just like the other ones. The identity specification is turned on. Title, description of varchar max. This will allow us to put as many characters in that field as we need to. So sometimes RSS feeds can contain the full text of the article, in which case 1,000 characters is not going to be enough. We're going to need potentially pages and pages of data within SQL Server in order to store that data. The link type varchar 1000, date acquired, and the channel ID, again, foreign key relationship back to the channel table. Notice also that the description and the link are listed here as nullable fields, so that if it is a RSS feed that is not following the RSS specification, then we can still save that data into our database. Notice that the title and the news item and other columns are not nullable, meaning that they have to be filled in order for that data to be saved to the database. Okay. Then what I did also, and what I'll commonly do, especially when I'm first starting to work, is to add some just test dummy data. And so if you take a look at the show table data, I created 1 or 2 sample folders, tech news blog feeds. Okay, just hard coded those into our database by hand. Again, for the channel, let's take a look at that table data. So I added an MSDN, the MSNBC Tech and Science news feed, and a blogger named Rob Howard. active in the ASP.NET community, added his as well. Also hand-coded the folder ID so that they have some associations. And then finally, with the news item, just added some, I think just one feed just so we can test it and make sure that something shows up. So you can see here, this is a test description, some crazy link, and the data acquired, which I hand-coded and tied it into a specific channel, the first channel. Okay, so let's close all that down. The next thing that I did was that I wanted to create a data set. So going up to the data menu, selected add new data source, and then selected my database, the RSS MDF, and went through that process. And if this is not familiar to you, I would recommend taking a look at lessons 8 and 9 to review some of those concepts before you continue on. But ultimately, the result of going through that wizard was this RSS dataset.xsd. Now let's take a look at the dataset. Notice that its hierarchy and its structure closely resembles the database structure that we created. We have the same columns and the same table names and so forth. Okay, so just to make sure that everything worked and that I'm able to pull data from the database and display it on screen, I just wanted to do a real quick binding of some of the controls. So, for example, I went to the folder combo box and data bound it to the folder binding source. So I went to other data sources and drilled down until I found the folder table. Okay, and it automatically then created that folder binding source for me. I'm just going to hit the escape button on my keyboard to get out of that so I don't make any changes. And once I had the folder binding source added it for me, then I selected the display member and the value member. The display member is going to be the folder name because we want to display the name in the combo box. Behind the scenes, each individual folder name is going to be associated with the folder ID. We're going to use that folder ID in order to find the relationships between a specific folder and all of the channels that are associated by that primary foreign key relationship through this foreign key ID field. This folder ID field, sorry. I did something very similar for channels, binding it to the channel binding source. So how did I get that? Again, I went, before it was even visible, I went to other data sources, drilled down, and found channel, selected it. By virtue of the fact that I selected it, it then added this channel binding source configured for me. Whoops. Then I was able to select the channel title and the channel ID for the display member and value member respectively. And then finally, the same thing would be true then for the news item list box. So let's just see how this works at this point. I'm going to run the application, see if we can actually just pull data from the database and display it. Okay, excellent. You can see here that I've got my folders, that I've got my channels, and I've got a news item. So at this point, these three controls are not working in tandem. They're working independently. So in other words, I'm binding to all the folders, I'm binding to all the channels, and I'm binding to all the news items. Now that's not going to work for what we eventually have envisioned for our application. Ideally, what will happen is when we select a folder, it will only display those channels that are associated with that folder. Same thing is true when I select a channel, it will only display those news items that are associated with that channel. So that's really our next step, and we'll cover that in the next video. So that concludes our first 5 snapshots. Hopefully things are making sense. If not, please download the code and look through it. Look through what I did and see if it all makes sense to you at this point in time before continuing on. Thank you.